Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Godels and Pat Cummings. When I think of jazz, words like creativity, improvisation, and technical mastery come to mind. But I don't think of the history of racism, corruption, and the inherent dangers surrounding the music. The history of the art form reflects the exploitation and economic practices of our broader society. Today, let's discuss jazz, justice, and the political economy of the music. Well, warm greetings, everybody. We're here with Dr. Gerald Horne talking about not his most recent book, but a recent book, Jazz and Justice. And for those who don't know Dr. Horne, he's a very prolific author, historian of history of American studies at the University of Houston. I quit counting at 30, 40 books. I'm quite a big fan. I'm chipping away at your books one at a time. In fact, before we get to Jazz and Justice.
Oh, great!
I am third of the way through this. Greg isn't. When I'm finished with this, I'll send it on to Greg. This is so current. It's the counter-revolution of 1836, Texas, slavery, Jim Crow, and the roots of U.S. fascism. And tell me a little bit about that book before we get into your Jazz and Justice.
Well, as you know, right now I'm living in Southeast Texas. And ever since I've been here, which has been a few decades now, the history of this land has fascinated me, not least because I had already known that Texas had been the headquarters of a number of fearsome Native American groupings led by the Comanches. And I oftentimes wondered what had happened to them. And that was my entry point into this present book. And as the subtitle suggests, living in the United States in the wake of January 6, 2021, the apparent comeback of Agent Orange in 2024, if he's not jailed first. It has intrigued me and interested me in terms of exploring, as the subtitle suggests, the roots of U.S. fascism.
And you're kind of picking up from what Molly Ivins did with comedy. You're taking the torch from her and carrying it, exposing the rather crazy governance in that state, and how it's a petri dish for what goes forth to the rest of our country. It's kind of sad but funny at the same time. So anyway, that's a wonderful book. But we're here to talk about Jazz and Justice. Greg and I just love this book. Anytime we have a book that we end up talking back and forth about, we know it hit a nerve, and this one certainly did. It's the racism and the political economy of the music. And this may be a little bit over the top, but Cornel West says that you are one of the greatest historians of our time. I don't know what you had to do to get Cornel to say that, but I'm not so sure I disagree with you. Your production and your scholarship, you richly research everything that you do. And
how many Gerald Hornes are there? There must be 2 or 3 to put these books out. It's remarkable.
Well, with regard to Cornell, it's amazing what passing on a few greenbacks will do.
He's one of my. He's an absolute national treasure also. So, this book was published a couple of years ago. Am I assuming you started to do your research during the middle of the pandemic, or how did it coincide with COVID?
Well, actually, like some of my projects, I think that this research began actually when I was a young boy in St. Louis, Missouri. That is to say, I grew up in a household where music was ubiquitous. For whatever reason, my late father always had a guitar around, which my younger brother, Marvin Horne, eventually picked up. And as you suggested, he's now a well-known musician. We oftentimes had a piano in the house as well. And then on the block in which I grew up in St. Louis, up the street, was the family of the late trumpeter Lester Bowie of the Art Ensemble of Chicago. His father was a music teacher at a local Black high school. Lester's younger brother, Joseph Bowie, a trombonist, had been playing in bands with my younger brother, Marvin, ever since they were about 10 or 11. So I think it's fair to say that the roots of this particular project were planted early on. And then, as noted in the text, St. Louis has contributed more than its share with regard to notable musicians. We claim Miles Dewey Davis, even though he's from across the river in Alton. Clark Terry, for example. I mentioned Lester Bowie, Marvin Horne. And so I think growing up in that atmosphere helped to prepare me to tackle this project.
And Bowies are the Marcelluses of St. Louis in a way, just a family that's rich in the jazz scene there. So, you know, I don't know how to. I want to start this book by just having a general comment about I love my iPhone. It's wonderful. It brings great joy to my life, just like jazz does. But I don't want to think too hard about how the iPhone is made, about the 12-year-old kids that are working on this 60 hours a week, or the horrible exploitation of the precious metals used to make the iPhone. In a way, I think that's what your book does with jazz. This is just a extraordinary, powerful, wonderful part of so many people's lives. It's complex, it's rich, it's intellectual, and yet it has a pretty ugly underbelly in our country of exploitation, and that's the kind of the two themes of your book as I see it. The one is this how did this art form come to us? The second part of it is there were problems with this art form and how these jazz musicians were treated and maybe still are treated. I don't know. Do you think that's an accurate overview of?
Well, certainly. Obviously, there have been some improvements over the decades, but at root, the music still reflects the socioeconomic context, being capitalist exploitation. And just like capitalist exploitation over the decades, the pace and the nature of exploitation has eroded to a certain extent because people struggle. For example, they organize, they fight back, but we have not achieved total victory as of yet, to put it mildly. And I think, as I recall in the introduction to this book, I suggest that the music is equivalent to the lotus that grows in the mud. And the mud being the nature of capitalist exploitation, and the lotus being the beauty and the creativity and the originality of the music itself. Now, with regard to this music, there's contestation, as I tried to indicate early on, with regard to the origins of this music. The consensus has been that it originates in New Orleans, and that in part it stems from the point that with regard to the US Civil War, 1861 to 1865, the Lincoln forces seized this major Dixie port early on. And then, as you probably know, the military specializes in having bands and orchestras. As a matter of fact, this may be in the book, but the Pentagon probably spends more on bands. It spends, if you have $1 trillion to play with, you can spend a lot on a lot of things. And it probably spends more on bands than any other entity. And so as the troops withdraw, and unfortunately they withdraw, which then leads to a comeback by the reactionaries and the former slave owners, because New Orleans has a bloody history. But as they leave their instruments, then they're oftentimes picked up by the newly emancipated. That's one factor. Another factor, of course, is that New Orleans, before the Civil War, has a very rich musical history. Opera, for example, opera companies, for example. And so when you mix all of these factors together, you begin to see why New Orleans, which also has Congo Square, which is a place where the enslaved in downtown New Orleans used to go, particularly for percussion. And then that's not even to get into the question of the pre-existing musical legacy brought to North America by Africans. For example, the leading prison in Louisiana to this very day is Angola State Prison, named after the Southwest African nation, which supplied all too many enslaved Africans. So there's a lot to be said with regard to this New Orleans story. But as I've suggested, in New Orleans, patriots oftentimes get upset when I question their ownership of the origins of this music. But I think part of it has to do with the fact also that Tulane University, a major university in New Orleans, early on began to capture oral histories by New Orleans musicians. Some of these musicians are born as early as the late 1860s. And I think that tends to overdetermine what the historians say, because if you look at the history of Memphis, another Mississippi River port town, if you look at the richness of the musicians that have come out of Memphis, let's perhaps begin with the saxophonist Charles Lloyd, who fortunately is still in the land of the living. You could make a similar case with regard to Memphis, with regard to some of these factors. And of course, it's not as if the Lincoln Army took over Memphis as early as 1862, but still. And I think one of the differences is that these archivists in Tulane did not have an equivalent in Memphis, at the University of Memphis, for example. And you could make a similar case with regard to my hometown, St. Louis, another Mississippi River town. And the archivists at St. Louis University and Washington University were not as energetic as the archivists in Tulane. And I could go on with regard to these possible origin stories, but let me apologize in advance to our friends from New Orleans who tend to get upset if their patrimony is questioned.
Well, that was one of the things that I thought was interesting about your book that I learned. I just thought everything happened from New Orleans. It started in New Orleans. Mm-hmm. Then they break up Storyville, which is all of the flop houses, mm-hmm. and so the musicians scattered, and that created. But you really do a good job of talking about it's New Orleans, it's Kansas City, St. Louis, New Jersey, Cuba, mm-hmm. Memphis, mm-hmm. and of course now New York, maybe Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. And as I was reading your book, I was listening to music and I went through all of these cities and created playlists in Spotify that I'll post if people are interested. Jazz is rich across all of our country. It's not just the Mississippi River, it's places where the Mississippi didn't go. And it's maybe you could make a story one way or the other that New Orleans gets maybe a little bit too much credit.
Careful.
Okay, yeah. All right.
But you're both making a really, I think, great account of its origins and its roots. But what I think is unique to it is how it draws on all those influences in a way that a few other musical forms do. I mean, it really, everywhere jazz appeared, it added something to it that was unique and was retained. And and shaped jazz and kept it alive and kept it creative for so long. I mean, it didn't get stuck in the mud, not the mud that Professor Horne was talking about, but it didn't get stuck in the mud. It grew and it evolved, and it was always something alive. But I think we don't want to lose track of the political economy that Professor Horne has in his subtitle. And I think that's where the great tragedy comes from, in that it's such a cherished art form in this country, and yet it was exploited so dramatically and fully and completely from its inception. And yet it was so great. And you look at other countries that embraced it when we really didn't. It's pretty amazing. It really says something about what a contribution it was to the world of music because it wasn't embraced here. And I think that's a lot of the story I draw from this book. I mean, really, it explains why it wasn't embraced here, why it was exploited, why it didn't become the classical music of America, why there weren't halls dedicated, fundraisers among the wealthy to support it, as there was with classical music and so on. That's in the book, I think, in the political economy that is developed here. What do you think? Let me ask you this. I look back at the 50s because I'm a product of the 50s. I'm aged. But it seems to me that's when things turned bad. I mean, that's when jazz really got pushed aside. And of course, rock and roll played a role in that. But even the universities, I mean, when you think about jazz, when I was growing up, if you were a college person, it was Dave Brubeck because he did the college and he was white. And if you were, let's say, rebellious, it was the Beat Generation, and they wrote extensively about jazz. But it was Jerry Mulligan, it was Stan Getz, and Pacific, West Coast jazz, all white. So it was like as though the African American contribution in the 50s was suppressed. And I wonder if you think TV had something to do with that. The fact that we had a national medium emerging and we had segregation at the same time. And so you didn't want to have Black faces in a medium representing music. Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there is something to what you say, but as I'm sure as some of our more alert listeners and viewers may know, one of the reasons why we have figures like Lester Young, the saxophonist, and Billie Holiday, the singer, why we have them on film is because of television. The late Nat Hentoff, a former columnist for the Village Voice, amongst other publications, and of course, who wrote liner notes to countless jazz albums, he plays a role. But certainly there could have been more. There certainly could have been many more of these musicians on the boob tube than there were. And then with regard to the 1950s, there's something of a divergence. On the one hand, you see with the 1950s, as you know more than most, there is the Red Scare. And so you had these musicians, such as the trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie, for example, who were sympathetic to figures like the late, great Paul Robeson. You may know that the major innovator, Charles Yardbird Parker of Kansas City and New York, he has been captured on audio, although it's not oftentimes mentioned when it's played on the air. For example, WKCR.org, which is one of my favorite stations for the music. Yardbird is playing at a benefit for the communist leader, Ben Davis.
Right.
Who, of course, was elected to the New York City Council in 1943, reelected in 1945, before being jailed a few years later because of the Smith Act. And so what happens with regard to the 1950s is that on the one hand, with the organized left being routed, this has detrimental knock-on effects concerning labor union organizing by the musicians, consciousness of the musicians. But at the same time, the United States is moving in a somewhat contrasting direction because at that moment, US imperialism is under ideological assault because African and Caribbean nations are coming to independence. US apartheid, Jim Crow is seen as contradictory to this idea of the United States being a paragon of human rights virtue. And so that creates enormous pressure for the erosion of the most horrible aspects of Jim Crow. And then that, to a certain degree, opens up certain kinds of opportunities. For example, this is the time the United States government begins to send many of these musicians abroad, because supposedly jazz represents freedom, as the saying went. And of course, this has effects, ricochet effects in terms of the music. If I'm not mistaken, one of the most lovely tunes of the late composer and pianist and band leader Duke Ellington was Isfahan, which is also the name of a Persian Iranian city where Duke Ellington and his orchestra toured. And I should also say that even before the State Department tours of the 1950s, and recall as well that this put pressure on the musicians. Recall what happened in 1957 when Louis Armstrong is touring abroad. Louis Armstrong being one of the major innovators of the music, singer, trumpeter, composer, and he's being queried about the desegregation crisis at Little Rock High School in Arkansas. And he unleashes a tirade against the United States government that gets national and international publicity, putting further pressure on the United States. And so there are these contradictory trends with regard to the music. And I should also say, even before the State Department, when I interrupted myself, even before the State Department was sending these musicians abroad, as the comments of one of you, perhaps both of you, tended to suggest, the skill that these musicians had meant that they were employable overseas. And so there was a mighty jazz diaspora. Booker Pittman, the grandson of the late Black leader, Booker T. Washington, eventually went into permanent exile in Brazil. He was a clarinetist. My colleague, Douglas Henry Daniels, who wrote this biography of Lester Prez Young, is now working on a book about the jazz diaspora in the Asia Pacific region, particularly in Japan, where there are numerous clubs that focus on the music, jazz clubs, that is to say, where there are numerous releases of the music. And of course, pre-1949, pre-Chinese revolutionary Shanghai was also a lodestar for the music as well. And he's traveled there to do research. British India also was a lodestar for the music. And even today, as we speak, there is this trend with regard to Filipino musicians being popular throughout the Asian Pacific region. To a certain extent, this is an outgrowth of the point that beginning with the so-called Spanish-American War of 1898, you had the outflow of Black American soldiers to the Philippines, many of them musicians. And so now, if you go to a club in Dubai or in Hong Kong, you're likely to find a Filipino cover band that does not only jazz, but does all manner of music. And of course, they're very good. And I haven't even talked about Europe, where the late great saxophonist Dexter Gordon spent many of his best years. Miles Davis, the drummer Kenny Clark. I think he had roots in Pittsburgh, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, spent a good deal of time in France, for example. So this, in a nutshell, it tends to liberate these musicians, because many of them can earn incomes that they might not have been able to earn in the United States, and then they can send the money back home, remittances as they're called now, which keeps their families afloat and allows their families more flexibility in terms of joining the struggle. So there's a kind of a virtuous circle that's created that has very positive impact on the struggle right here at home.
Well, going back to Greg's question, was it TV that helped or hurt? I think in your book, you talked about Leopold Truskowski with Fantasia, who didn't think Ron Carter, the bass player, was a very good fit because he didn't want to have a black bass player on the. And you also mentioned the Merv Griffin show back in the 70s when a group of musicians kind of stormed the stage because at this time, all the house bands on these TV shows were white musicians, and these were good gigs. They didn't have Questlove or Baptiste or whatever. I
was lucky to. I saw the television show when Rahsaan Roland Kirk and I think it was Archie Shepp interrupted Ed Sullivan, and consequently they disrupted it. They actually disrupted it. It consequently got a performance on that TV show, but they were underlining the fact that you really didn't see black musicians playing jazz on television. Yeah, there was Ralph Gleason, and there was that Playboy thing too. Hugh Hefner had a show where he'd feature some jazz musicians, but the big shows, you never saw any black jazz musicians, and they were underscoring that fact. It was pretty dramatic. It was fun to just happenstance that I actually saw it live.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Archie Shepp, who fortunately is still in the land of the living and is one of the giants of the music, and certainly one of the more politicized of the musicians. And I heartily recommend his album Attica Blues, which obviously marks the prison revolt that takes place in upstate New York about a half century ago, which has ricocheting effects all over the United States with regard to prisoners' uprisings, including in Northern California, which leads, unfortunately, to the killing of George Jackson, one of the leading black prisoner intellectuals. And I'm glad you mentioned Rahsaan Roland Kirk as well, not only because of his creativity, being able to play all these instruments at once, it's sort of like a one-man band, but it gives us an opportunity to salute the what might be called the differently able musicians, what used to be called disabled musicians, because his vision was not very keen. And as sometimes it's suggested, I don't know if it's accurate, that can lead to more acuity with regard to other senses, such as hearing. And there's been a long history of musicians whose sight is impaired. Let's talk about Stevie Wonder, for example.
Ray Charles,
for example. I mean, the list is long. Who have made enormous contributions to U.S. popular music, at least.
Yeah. Let's get back to how these musicians were exploited and screwed. And I want to talk about Irving Mills. Here is Irving Mills's tombstone. He was from 1894 to 1985. Beloved husband, father, and great-grandfather, Irving Mills, humanitarian. So I went on to Discog and looked at, you can see all of the musicians and everybody, and he has one album to his credit. He has 7,605 credits, though, on Discog. So that brings us to the album I just picked up a couple of days ago. This is Duke Ellington. And when we look here at the album, Minnie the Moocher, Cab Calloway, and Irving Mills. I'm Getting Sentimental Over You, Neil Waters, Washington, and Mills Music. And then, he finds himself written into the music credits for a huge number of these musicians. So the question to you, is he really a beloved husband, father, and humanitarian, or is he something else.
Snake.
Yeah, could they just put snake maybe? Or so
well,
I don't know. Tell me about that. Tell me what some of your research was regarding these subjects.
Well, I understand why his family is sentimental about his passing, because of his ability to appear Zellick-like on liner notes and tunes, 7,000 strong, as you suggested. What that means is that there's still a steady stream of royalties going to his descendants, as opposed to going to the descendants of Duke Ellington, for example.
To this day.
To this very day. Or to the descendants of Billy Strayhorn, for example, Duke Ellington's right-hand man.
From Pittsburgh.
Sorry?
That's
right, Pittsburgh, exactly.
You'll find those when I post the Spotify. You'll be able to keep track of who's where. But I have him in Pittsburgh. Yeah, my notes. Go ahead.
So this is an essential part of the exploitation, but this allows me to raise another point, which I think is of significance, which is the role of organized crime, with regard to music, where it has an early influence in New Orleans, for example, in terms of Storyville, the so-called red light district of New Orleans, and it has an early influence in Kansas City. Now, I tend to follow this path where a chapter on New Orleans followed by a chapter on Kansas City. Now, you don't have to be a geography expert to realize that Kansas City is not on the Mississippi River. And so that tends to disrupt this idea about the music starting in New Orleans, and with Storyville being disrupted, the musicians all head north. Of course, many of these musicians are from New Jersey. They're from all over the country. And then, of course, many of them from Kansas City as well, such as Charlie Yardbird Parker, aforementioned. And so what's interesting about Kansas City is the influence of organized crime in the clubs, so notorious that it's depicted in Hollywood cinema. There's the movie, I think it's called Kansas City, that deals with the music, yes, and notoriously depicts the influence of organized crime, which in turn is connected to the political machine in Kansas City, which helps to give rise to the man who becomes US president, Harry S. Truman, between 1945 and 1952, coming directly out of that seamy background. And I tell a story about St. Louis as well that I find intriguing, and those who are interested can look at the footnote. I retrieved it from a dissertation because I think it's a fascinating story. So what happens in St. Louis is that on the one hand, you have Klan elements, Ku Klux Klan elements, who want to bar Black musicians altogether from clubs. And then you have organized crime figures who do not want to do that. They just want to exploit them shamelessly. And so there's a showdown between the Klan and the organized crime figures. And of course, the latter emerged triumphant. And so the Black musicians win the dubious right, quote unquote, to be exploited shamelessly as opposed to being excluded. And I also talk about that influence with regard to Chicago and how the late great pianist Earl Father Hines talks about some of the riffs that he's improvising on some of his signal tunes comes from the sound of gunfire, for example.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, the bebop too was, the sound they.
Right. I think it was Dizzy Gillespie who said also part of the bebop sound comes from the sound of batons on Negroes' heads.
Yeah. I don't know if that's a good, true story, but it's a good story. So.
Right.
Yeah.
So organized crime, I think progressive forces in the United States need to pay more attention to it as a material force, because you can see the presence on these shores of my ancestors, for example, by dint of the unlimited African slave trade, as being sort of an early form of organized crime. That is to say, kidnapping labor, forcing labor to work for free. And then after the African slave trade is legalized in the United States, circa 1808, it continues, which is a form of crime. And so organized crime, I think, as we try to have an understanding of this vast land in which we live, so that we can seek to transform it, it would help to have a deeper understanding of this material force that has had such a noxious impact upon labor relations in particular.
Yeah, and you mentioned that with labor. In 1943, only New York and Detroit were the only two cities that had allowed blacks into the union, musicians union. And then when they decided to integrate them, they got screwed,
Right.
It was like, okay, now we'll let you in. Now you're screwed. It's like Brown versus Board of Education. Now that we have our schools integrated, all these black academics and teachers would just lost their jobs.
Right.
So,
yeah, and it would have been helpful if, of course, the left was on the defensive, to be fair, in the 1950s, when all of these titanic trends were unfolding. I think that helps to explain some of the deficits in terms of understanding what's happening. I mean, it's difficult to keep a bead on what's happening in your country if you're underground, or if you're fleeing overseas, if you're in prison, et cetera. But certainly with regard to the latter trend, and I noticed that you gentlemen have a particular fondness for Pittsburgh. And some of my major insights with regard to the musicians' unions comes from the papers of musicians locals at the University of Pittsburgh. Because as you suggest, what happens is that beginning in the 1950s, you have so-called desegregation of the musicians locals. That is to say, at one time you would have a Negro local, and then you'd have a non-Negro local. One of the interesting things about United States Jim Crow is that oftentimes that term non-Negro is a posit. It's appropriate because they're mostly white, but others who are not Negro could enter as well. And I think that stems from something else the left needs to focus on in this country, which is a particular oppression of Black people, which is not only based on slavery, not only based on racism, but is based upon the aspects of slavery, that is to say, being property that's expropriated without compensation, which leads to fury and leads to a thirst for revenge, which distinguishes the Black population from other, quote, minorities, unquote. So what happens in Pittsburgh, and indeed throughout a good deal of the United States, is that desegregation basically means liquidation of the Negro local. Oftentimes they toss out their records, for example. Oftentimes the emerging desegregated local, the Euro-American musicians, they have special relationships with the club owners. So they cut deals with the club owners to exclude the Black musicians. And so obviously this sours many of these Black musicians and their families on the alleged benefits of desegregation. So it's the Chinese talk about win-win. Well, this was not a win-win situation, to put it mildly.
In your book, you generously acknowledge white musicians who participated in the development of the music and the ongoing pursuit of the music, but that's not always the case. And you indicate that many people were appropriating the music, not just participating. I mean, people like from my own experience, Charlie Hayden, for example, was most appreciative of the music and always understood the roots of it and brought something to it and did it respectfully. But other musicians were appropriating it, and they were appropriating it without any gratitude or an acknowledgement. Can you speak to that?
Well, certainly. I'm glad you mentioned Charlie Haight, the bassist, also highly politicized, to put it mildly. As I recall in that book, I recount a vignette of Charlie Hayden and his band playing in Portugal before the overthrow of fascism. And as I recall, he plays his remarkable tune, Song for Che, which is, of course, referring to the Cuban-Argentine revolutionary Che Guevara, and then barely escaping imprisonment. And then, of course, there's Dave Brubeck, who I think you mentioned was seen in some quarters as being a leader of the music on the cover of Time magazine, which at that time in the 1950s meant something. He also left a remarkable archive, which I drew upon at the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California, which allowed me to tell many tales about how Dave Brubeck in the 1950s, he refused, a la Paul Robeson, to play in segregated venues. Mm-hmm. That is to say, historically in the United States, either A, there was exclusion of the Black component of the audience, or B, there would be a rope down the middle of the concert hall, and you put Black people on one side and non-Black people on the other side. Dave Brubeck refused to participate in that. But as you suggest, there were a number of musicians who decided to go with the flow, not to protest. And there's one musician from New Orleans, his name escapes me, who even tries to denigrate the idea that the music has roots in Africa, because of course, this is in the 1930s when the reputation of colonized Africa is not at its zenith, to put it mildly, at the United States, and it was seen as being a defect or liability to suggest that this musical form had roots in Africa. But I should also say, because I want to give your audience a fuller picture, that struggle against these various forms of oppression was unrelenting over the decades. And I think that to the extent that we've made progress, it comes from the existence of that real and salient fact. I mean, for example, one of you mentioned how in many US cities, you have orchestras that are paid by the state or by the city.
Right.
And now, of course, you have the Lincoln Center Jazz Orchestra in New York City under the leadership of Wynton Marsalis. You have the SF Jazz in San Francisco, which has a lovely hall, which engages in music education throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. And it's important to recognize that these are victories, but these are victories that came from blood, sweat, and tears. These are victories that came from relentless struggle. And I think that that's one of the lessons of this book that we should carry away.
Greg, what were you talking about with the blind? Oh,
Art Davis. Art Davis was an extraordinary bass player. I mean, that's my own personal opinion. When his performances with Coltrane, which are underappreciated, he's on a few of his albums, early albums, it was just stunning. But he was that great of a bass player, but he was turned down in an audition for a concert gig, and I think it was the New York Philharmonic. And after a long period of struggle, they were forced to submit auditions behind screens because they were denying access to Black musicians because they were Black. And so that did change. And again, as Professor Horne says, that's a product of a long struggle. Very long struggle to get that kind of justice.
I should also mention that opens the door, this screen practice, to opening more opportunities for women musicians. And there's a lengthy and glorious history of the exploitation of women musicians, including by certain critics. Critics, of course, play a role in the music and in my book as well. who rail at the idea of women bassists, for example, who rail at the idea of women horn players, supposedly because of their dearth of lung capacity, for example. Women being exploited by fellow musicians, for example. As you know, with regard to many of these gigs, these jobs, it's done on a sort of an ad hoc basis, like recruiting for a pickup basketball game. And so when a woman musician then calls the home of some male musician with regard to getting the gig, this can create issues for the male musician sometimes, and not to mention the sexual harassment and crude exploitation of many of the women musicians as well. And this, I would say, is one of the areas where there's still a need for progress. Of course, there's a need for progress about every area of the music, but certainly this is an area where there's much more work that needs to be done. And you mentioned Art Davis, and I think one of you also mentioned Ron Carter. And of course, Ron Carter, he's in his 80s now and is still in the land of the living and has appeared on countless albums, too numerous to mention. And like many musicians, including my younger brother, Marvin, were able to do quite well playing in Japan. Playing in Japan, say for a few weeks, could carry you for months, if not longer, after you come back to the States.
You know, the one thing I got from your book that I didn't think about prior to reading is how dangerous it was to be a jazz musician. You had these club owners that exploited you, wouldn't pay you. People had to pack guns because it was so dangerous. And I think you could make a good argument. I'm not so sure it's one of the most dangerous careers. You know, I mean, of course, Greg's family is all coal miners. He might argue with me, but you know, it was hard. It was hard to do. It was hard to travel. It was hard to find accommodations in the South. And all along the way, people were out to exploit you. I don't know.
Don't forget the police. Don't forget the police. They were not friendly either to jazz musicians. And cabaret license in New York, that was another way of destroying a career of a jazz musician.
You know, there's a famous picture of Miles Davis being bloodied by the New York City police officer. And that scene is replicated in the movie with Don Cheadle, the actor playing Miles. And with regard to the health question, then there's the issue of before the current period, musicians playing in smoky clubs, which is sort of romanticized, but obviously that secondhand smoke is having deleterious impact on the health of these musicians. And then there's a basic contradiction that I should sketch, which is that it's oftentimes suggested, I'm not sure if it's true, but I'll repeat it, that to be a chess grandmaster, you have to be weak in everything else. Well, certainly musicians, sometimes these musicians would practice 16 hours a day. And as a matter of fact, Branford Marsalis says this is one of the reasons for the early exit from life of John Coltrane, that he sort of blew out his system by practicing so much. But if you're practicing 16 hours a day, well, then how can you keep up with the nuts and bolts of your contracts with record companies with regard to being paid and if you're being compensated adequately? So there are many contradictions of being a modern, not to mention a non-modern musician, just by virtue of trying to be expert with your instrument and considering some of the unavoidable downstream consequences of same.
And frankly, they were better musicians than a lot of the white musicians. I mean, Bill Evans is one of my favorite pianists, and I like a lot of white jazz musicians, but they were doing things that other musicians at the time could not do. They couldn't play bebop as well. They couldn't play some of the music because not only were they, they worked harder. I don't know. Maybe that's a racist thing to say, but I think it's statistically correct that the preponderance of jazz coming out of our country, the best of the best were the Black musicians.
Well, certainly the innovators, be it Coltrane, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Charles Mingus, who we haven't mentioned as of yet. And with regard to bebop, one of the stories that I represent in these pages is that there are many elements that lead to the creation of this music form, which is still with us in the 1940s. One having to do with New York City cracking down on clubs where there's dancing, because there's interracial dancing, that is to say, interracial heterosexual dancing with Black men and non-Black women, for example, and that was seen as a faux pas. But also there's evidence to suggest that many of these musicians were consciously trying to complexify the music, which would make it difficult to imitate, make it difficult to be ripped off or replicated, for example. And I should also mention as well that, I published in a number of fields, but this field of jazz studies, it's a very sensitive field to publish in, because on the one hand, as you suggest, many of the creators and innovators are Black, but most of the critics are not. Most of the analysts are not. And despite what some of the critics and analysts might say, I think that can create problems, because the United States, it doesn't have a very strong left-wing movement. I'm sorry to break that to people, but we wouldn't be talking about talking about a comeback of Agent Orange if we had a strong left-wing movement. And I think that impacts the consciousness across the board, and it leads to certain kinds of insensitivity that then comes across with regard to those who write about this music, those who write about the musicians. And as I said, it also has impact with regard to gender as well, because most of the critics are not women, to put it mildly. And I think that feeds and fuels a certain kind of gender insensitivity as well.
Right.
The critical field was dominated when I was a youngster by Downbeat magazine. And their writers were almost, I think they were early on when I started buying it, all white. And they were pretty much obstacles to the development of the music all along. And they're particularly hostile to Black innovators. I remember when I started subscribing to Downbeat, and I got the issue, I guess early 60s, Abbey Lincoln and Max Roach had a very controversial album, which was about racism and about civil rights movement. And the furor among the white critics to that album, the hostility was just unbelievable. I was a youngster. I didn't have a great understanding of things, but I could see and sense that hostility. And then a few years later, with Coltrane's development and involvement and essentially stardom, leading the charge here, Ira Gettler and a few other writers, he called it anti-jazz, and they're just a huge attack about something they didn't understand. And I think that's been really a problem in the music, because Downbeat was the magazine. It was the magazine for critical analysis.
Rolling Stone has a big thing now of Kool and the Gang, kind of revisiting them, and they have a lot of their YouTube videos. They were good and innovative. But at the time, it's like you said, at the time they were just sort of pop stuff, and they didn't get their due for being so innovative as they were. So anyway.
Yeah, and I'm glad we keep mentioning John Coltrane, obviously one of the creators and innovators of the music, who dies prematurely. But as you suggest, when he tried to go in certain directions musically, many of the critics were not willing to go along with him. I mean,
sheets of sound, you know. Exactly.
And then, of course, we should also credit some of his tunes, such as Alabama, that pay homage to the September 1963 bombing of the church in Birmingham, which leads to the killing of these little Black girls. And of course, has dynamic impact on a young Angela Davis, who's growing up in Alabama and who knew many of these young Black girls who were killed. And so this music is a prism through which we can seek to understand and hopefully gain a better comprehension of this country in which we live, so that we can be more effective fighters in struggling against oppression and making a better world altogether.
Speaking of strong political activists, tell me some of your thoughts about Mingus.
Oh yeah, he's one of my favorites.
He's a rascal, wasn't he? He was a rascal, and I love him. He just to the end, he just never changed. Always such a strong force, strong man.
You know, he's born in the borderlands, Nogales, Arizona, not far distant from Mexico, and of course dies in Mexico as well. And there's a documentary about his later years. It's probably on YouTube. Where there is a remarkable scene, which is quite illustrative, of Mingus being evicted from his New York City residence. I mean, here you have one of the greatest and most creative musicians of all time in the process of having all of his art and all of his belongings being placed on the streets of Manhattan. It's remarkable. And then, of course, he left us with his memoir, Beneath the Underdog, which some of your audience might find difficult to get through. But if you do get through it, I think you'll be rewarded. And certainly he's been the subject of a number of biographies as well. And need I mention one of my favorite tunes of all time, which is Haitian Fight Song. Which I try to play at every opportunity. And like Louis Armstrong, who railed against Governor Faubus, there's Fables of Faubus by Mingus as well. And then with Max Roach, who you mentioned, he tried to break the chain of exploitation by creating and distributing his music. But as I suggested, it's more than a notion to be a creative musician who has to practice quite a bit and then attend to a business and then deal with organized crime, which is not interested in seeing these Black musicians break into the business and disrupt the chain of exploitation. So, and I should mention too, for your audience who may be interested in pursuing these subjects further, the Library of Congress has the archives and papers of many musicians. Dexter, for example, Mingus, Duke Ellington, and then I mentioned University of Pittsburgh as well, which has remarkable collections, including of Earl Garner, who I think is Pittsburgh too. If I'm
Pittsburgh, yes, he is.
Many of the vignettes in the book about Earl Garner comes from that collection at the University of Pittsburgh. So there's much more work to do in every respect, not only in terms of struggle, but also in creating more histories based upon what these musicians have bequeathed to us in their archives.
Right. Speaking of the Haitian Fight Song, I was glad to see that you got your article published in the New York Times regarding Haiti and roots of reparation and Oh, wait, you didn't get credit for that, did you? That's correct. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Just that's a little. Well, you might want to tell. You literally wrote a book about that article and how Haiti was kind of screwed by the French and their horrible debt, and then the New York Times did a very good article about it, but I didn't see your name. I'm sorry. So,
well, the idea is to put these works into the bloodstream of the country, and hopefully they'll be picked up.
Yes. Yes.
So that's what happened. So bravo.
Yeah, good. No, I'm just ribbing you a little bit, but what are you working on? You're going from jazz and the problem with musicians. Now you're going to boxing. Is that book done?
Yeah, that book is out. Yeah.
Oh goodness, I haven't read. I can't keep up with you. Do you ever sleep?
Like a baby.
Okay. All right. Gee, many Christmas. So was the boxing book before this one then?
Yes.
I'm a book behind. Okay.
Yes.
All right. And many of the exact same themes are apparent between.
Oh yeah.
Can I assume that's correct?
Oh yeah. Especially boxing is probably worse with regard to organized crime than music, believe it or not. Not least because organized crime oftentimes forces boxers to lose on purpose so that they can place a bet and then beat the house. And if the boxer chooses not to go along, then they can be killed, for example. And it's, as I said, the whole question of organized crime and the political economy of capitalism. Now, of course, some of our more unforgiving critics will say, well, of course, capitalism itself is organized crime. Okay, fine. Well, we can stipulate that. But still, I don't think that relieves us of the responsibility for digging deeper into the machinations of these so-called organized crime families, as they call themselves.
Well, boy, thank you for your time today. I can't tell how much I love your book. I lent it to my neighbor across the street who's a jazz musician, and he was halfway through it, and I ran over the other day and said, give it back to me. I've got to review it for the podcast. So it's making its way around Ruston, Washington. If that's
before we started, I ran through the index. What a pleasure it is to just go through the index and pick out a name that you're familiar with, and then read what Professor Horne wrote about that musician. I just enjoyed it for about an hour, just a real treat. So great book.
Right on.
And I took a Spotify and I made by location the musicians that you mentioned in the book, and I'll put it in the show notes if people want to, as they read the book as I did, go through and listen to the various artists as you're talking about it. It was quite a treat for me, and I hope it'll be for others too. So.
Oh, great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Good luck.
All right.
Thank you.